Number 7. Taking a census out of pride. Our first bad decision takes us to near the end of David's reign, and honestly, this one is so bizarre that biblical scholars are still scratching their heads about it. The Bible tells us in 2 Samuel chapter 24:1 that again, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, "Go and take a census of Israel and Judah." But here's where it gets complicated. 1 Chronicles 21:1 says, "Satan rose up against Israel and incited David to take a census of Israel." So who was behind this census? Was it God testing David, or was it Satan tempting him? The answer is probably both, but what's clear is that David had a choice in how to respond, and he chose poorly. David decided to conduct a military census of Israel and Judah, which sounds innocent enough until you realise that God had specifically told the Israelites not to do this without proper religious protocols. In Exodus 30:12, God had given specific instructions. When you take a census of the Israelites to count them, each one must pay the Lord a ransom for his life at the time he is counted. Then no plague will come on them when you number them. David ignored these instructions completely. He wanted raw numbers for military planning, not a religious exercise of dependence on God. Now, you might be thinking, what's the big deal? It's just counting people. But in ancient Israel, conducting a census without following God's instructions was seen as an act of pride and self-reliance, basically saying, "I don't need God's help, I just need to know how many soldiers I have." It was the ancient equivalent of flexing your military might on social media, except with eternal consequences. David's motivation becomes clearer when you look at what he was actually counting. According to 2 Samuel 24:9, Joab reported the number of the fighting men to the king. In Israel, there were 800,000 able-bodied men who could handle a sword, and in Judah, 500,000. This wasn't a population count. This was a military assessment. David was essentially saying, "I want to know exactly how powerful my army is so I can feel secure in my own strength." Even David's military commander Joab, who wasn't exactly known for his moral sensitivity, tried to talk David out of this. The Bible records Joab's response in 2 Samuel chapter 24:3. But Joab replied to the king, "May the Lord your God multiply the troops 100 times over, and may the eyes of my lord the king see it. But why does my lord the king want to do such a thing?" Joab literally said, "Why does my lord want to do this thing? Why bring guilt on Israel?" When your morally questionable military commander, the same guy who would later murder people in cold blood, is telling you something's a bad idea, you should probably listen. But David's pride had been triggered, and he wouldn't back down. The text tells us in 2 Samuel 24:4 that the king's word, however, overruled Joab and the army commanders, so they left the presence of the king to enroll the fighting men of Israel. David pulled rank and forced his commanders to carry out an order they knew was wrong. The census took almost 10 months to complete. Joab and his men went throughout all the tribes of Israel, methodically counting every fighting man. But notice what happened during this time. David had almost 10 months to reconsider his decision. He could have called it off at any point, but his pride kept him committed to seeing it through. But David insisted, and the census went forward. The result? God sent a plague that killed 70,000 people in 3 days. Let that sink in for a moment. 70,000 innocent people died because their king decided he needed to count his soldiers. David was given 3 options for punishment in 2 Samuel 24:13. Go to David and say to him, "This is what the Lord says. I am giving you 3 options. Choose one of them for me to carry out against you. 3 years of famine in your land, or 3 months of fleeing from your enemies while they pursue you, or 3 days of plague in your land." David chose the plague because, as he said in verse 14, "I am in deep distress. Let us fall into the hands of the Lord, for his mercy is great, but do not let me fall into human hands." He chose what seemed like the shortest punishment, but 70,000 people died because David couldn't resist the urge to count his army. What makes this even more tragic is the timing. This happened near the end of David's reign, after he had experienced God's faithfulness for decades. He had seen God deliver him from lions, bears, Goliath, King Saul, and countless enemies. He had witnessed miracle after miracle, victory after victory. Yet when given the opportunity to trust God or trust his own military strength, he chose to count his soldiers. The worst part is that David seemed to know it was wrong even as he was doing it. 2 Samuel 24:10 tells us, David was conscience-stricken after he had counted the fighting men, and he said to the Lord, I have sinned greatly in what I have done. Now, Lord, I beg you, take away the guilt of your servant. I have done a very foolish thing. It's like he had a moment of clarity right after making one of the most costly decisions in Israel's history. This decision reveals something crucial about David's character flaws that would plague him throughout his reign. His tendency to act on impulse and his struggle with pride. Even after years of walking with God, David could still be tempted to rely on his own strength rather than trusting in God's power. The census wasn't just about numbers, it was about where David placed his confidence, and unfortunately, he placed it in human strength rather than divine power. Number 6. The Absalom situation. Now we're getting into David's parenting failures, and honestly, this is where things start to get really messy. This whole disaster begins with one of the most horrific family tragedies in the Bible. But David's response to it turns a terrible situation into an absolute catastrophe that nearly destroys his entire kingdom. Let me set the stage for you. David's son Absalom had murdered his half-brother Amnon in revenge for raping their sister Tamar. Now, we'll talk about David's failure to handle the original rape situation later, but for now, let's focus on what happened after Amnon's murder. Instead of dealing with this family crisis decisively, David made a series of half-hearted decisions that turned a family tragedy into a national crisis. The Bible tells us in 2 Samuel 13:39 that King David longed to go to Absalom, for he was consoled concerning Amnon's death. So David missed his son and wanted to see him, but he couldn't bring himself to actually do anything about it. Absalom had fled to his grandfather Talmai, king of Geshur, and stayed there for 3 years. 3 whole years of David wanting to see his son but being paralysed by indecision. Finally, David's commander Joab realised that this family dysfunction was affecting the entire kingdom. So Joab arranged an elaborate scheme involving a wise woman from Tekoa to convince David to bring Absalom back. This woman told David a parable about 2 sons, one of whom killed the other, and how the family wanted to execute the surviving son. She begged David not to let the family be destroyed by losing both sons. David saw right through the scheme, asking in 2 Samuel 14:19, "Isn't the hand of Joab with you in all this?" But he agreed to bring Absalom back anyway. Here's where David made another bizarre decision that shows his complete inability to handle this situation properly. In 2 Samuel 14:24, David said, "He must go to his own house. He must not see my face." So Absalom could return to Jerusalem, but he couldn't see his father, the king. Think about how insane this arrangement was. Absalom was back in the capital city, but essentially under house arrest, unable to see his father. This wasn't justice, it wasn't mercy, and it certainly wasn't healing. It was the worst of all possible worlds. Absalom was technically forgiven but still being punished, welcomed back, but kept at arm's length. This ridiculous situation went on for 2 more years. Can you imagine the psychological torture this must have been for Absalom? He was living in Jerusalem, probably able to see the palace from his house, knowing his father was right there but refusing to see him. The text tells us in 2 Samuel 14:28, Absalom lived 2 years in Jerusalem without seeing the king's face. Absalom got so frustrated with this arrangement that he tried to get a meeting with Joab to intervene for him, but even Joab wouldn't see him. So Absalom did what any rational person would do in this situation. He set Joab's barley field on fire. That got Joab's attention pretty quickly. When Joab confronted him about it, Absalom said in 2 Samuel 14:32, "Look, I sent word to you and said, 'Come here so I can send you to the king to ask, why have I come from Geshur? It would be better for me if I were still there. Now then, I want to see the king's face, and if I am guilty of anything, let him put me to death.'" Absalom was basically saying, either forgive me completely or execute me, but stop this ridiculous middle ground that's driving everyone crazy. And honestly, he had a point. David's indecision was creating more problems than either full forgiveness or full punishment would have created. Finally, Joab arranged the meeting, and 2 Samuel 14:33 tells us, "So Joab went to the king and told him this. Then the king summoned Absalom, and he came in and bowed down with his face to the ground before the king. And the king kissed Absalom." After 5 years of dysfunction, 3 years in exile and 2 years of partial reconciliation, father and son were finally reunited. But here's the tragedy. It was too late. During those 5 years of David's indecision, Absalom had been building resentment and making political connections. The text tells us in 2 Samuel 15:1 that in the course of time, Absalom provided himself with chariots and horses and with 50 men to run ahead of him. He was setting himself up like a king, building his own power base. Absalom began what we would today call a political campaign. 2 Samuel 15:2-6 describes his strategy. He would get up early and stand by the side of the road leading to the city gate. Whenever anyone came with a complaint to be placed before the king for a decision, Absalom would call out to him, "What town are you from?" He would answer, "Your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel." Then Absalom would say to him, "Look, your claims are valid and proper, but there is no representative of the king to hear you." And Absalom would add, "If only I were appointed judge in the land, then everyone who has a complaint or case could come to me, and I would see that they receive justice." Also, whenever anyone approached him to bow down before him, Absalom would reach out his hand, take hold of him, and kiss him. Absalom behaved in this way toward all the Israelites who came to the king for justice, and so he stole the hearts of the people of Israel. Absalom spent 4 years systematically undermining his father's government, telling everyone who would listen that he would be a better king than David. And it worked. When Absalom finally launched his rebellion, 2 Samuel 15:13 tells us that a messenger came and told David, "The hearts of the people of Israel are with Absalom." The rebellion forced David to flee Jerusalem in one of the most humiliating moments of his entire reign. 2 Samuel 15:30 describes the scene. But David continued up the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. His head was covered and he was barefoot. All the people with him covered their heads too, and were weeping as they went up. The great King David, reduced to fleeing his own capital city because his son had turned the people against him. The civil war that followed was brutal and devastating. Families were divided, the kingdom was torn apart, and thousands of people died. When the final battle came, David gave specific instructions in 2 Samuel 18:5. "Be gentle with the young man Absalom for my sake." But Joab, perhaps understanding that this rebellion would never truly end as long as Absalom lived, killed Absalom when he found him trapped in a tree. David's response to Absalom's death reveals the depth of his misplaced priorities. 2 Samuel 18:33 records his reaction. "The king was shaken. He went up to the room over the gateway and wept. As he went, he said, 'Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom. If only I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son.' David mourned so intensely for his rebellious son that his own troops felt ashamed for winning the battle that saved David's kingdom. Joab had to confront David about his inappropriate mourning, saying in 2 Samuel 19:5-6, "Today you have humiliated all your men, who have just saved your life and the lives of your sons and daughters, and the lives of your wives and concubines. You love those who hate you and hate those who love you. You have made it clear today that the commanders and their men mean nothing to you. I see that you would be pleased if Absalom were alive today and all of us were dead. This entire tragedy could have been avoided if David had made decisive choices earlier. If he had dealt properly with Amnon's assault on Tamar, Absalom might never have felt the need to take justice into his own hands. If he had either fully forgiven Absalom immediately or dealt with him according to the law, the 5-year period of resentment and political manoeuvring might never have happened. Instead, David's indecisiveness and inability to handle his family crisis had created a civil war that tore apart his kingdom and cost thousands of lives. Sometimes, the right decision made too late becomes the wrong decision entirely, and David's handling of the Absalom situation is a perfect example of how good intentions combined with poor execution can lead to catastrophic results. Number 5. Marrying multiple wives. David's choice to accumulate multiple wives and concubines wasn't just about political alliances or personal desire. It was a direct violation of God's specific instructions for Israel's kings, and the consequences would echo through generations. Let's start with what God actually said about this. In Deuteronomy 17:17, when giving instructions for future kings of Israel, God was crystal clear. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a divine command specifically designed to prevent exactly the kind of problems David would later face. But David ignored this completely. The Bible gives us a partial list of his wives in 2 Samuel 3:2-5. Sons were born to David in Hebron. His firstborn was Amnon, the son of Ahinoam of Jezreel. His second, Chileab, the son of Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. The third, Absalom, the son of Maacah, daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. The fourth, Adonijah, the son of Haggith. The fifth, Shephatiah, the son of Abital. And the sixth, Ithream, the son of Eglah, David's wife. These were born to David in Hebron. And that's just the wives from his time in Hebron. The text continues in 2 Samuel 5:13. After he left Hebron, David took more concubines and wives in Jerusalem, and more sons and daughters were born to him. By the end of his life, David had at least 8 named wives and an unknown number of concubines, producing at least 20 children that we know of. Now, you might think, well, that was just how kings operated back then. But here's the thing. God specifically warned against this practice because he knew exactly what would happen. When you have multiple wives from different families, tribes, and even nations, you create a complex web of competing interests, jealousies, and political complications within your own household. Each of David's wives brought her own agenda, her own family connections, and her own ambitions for her children. Maacah was the daughter of a foreign king, which gave Absalom both royal blood and foreign political connections he could use against his father. Haggith was the mother of Adonijah, who would later try to seize the throne. These weren't just personal relationships, they were political alliances that would eventually tear the kingdom apart. The competition between David's wives inevitably led to competition between their children. In a polygamous household, succession becomes a nightmare because there's no clear heir. Just a bunch of half-brothers with equal claims to their father's throne. This creates an environment where children are literally raised to compete against each other from birth. 1 Kings 1:5-6 gives us a glimpse of how this played out with Adonijah. Now Adonijah, whose mother was Haggith, put himself forward and said, "I will be king." So he got chariots and horses ready, with 50 men to run ahead of him. His father had never rebuked him by asking, "Why do you behave as you do?" He was also very handsome and was born next after Absalom. Notice that last detail. David had never disciplined Adonijah. Why? Because in a household with multiple wives and dozens of children, it becomes almost impossible to maintain proper relationships with all of them. David was spread too thin, trying to manage too many relationships, navigate too many family politics, and somehow be a father to children who were essentially raised in competition with each other. The Bible gives us another clue about the problems this created in 1 Kings 1:11, where the prophet Nathan had to scheme with Bathsheba to make sure Solomon became king instead of Adonijah. Even the succession had to be managed through palace intrigue, because David's family structure made normal succession impossible. But the marriage problems went beyond just creating succession issues. Each wife brought her own religious and cultural influences into the household. While David himself remained faithful to God, his foreign wives brought foreign gods and foreign practices into the royal family. This created spiritual confusion that would plague David's descendants for generations. The most tragic example of how David's multiple marriages created disaster is the rape of Tamar by Amnon. This happened because Amnon became obsessed with his half-sister, the daughter of a different wife. In a normal family structure, this situation would never have developed. But in David's complex household, half-siblings who weren't raised together created opportunities for exactly this kind of inappropriate attraction. 2 Samuel 13:1-2 describes the situation. In the course of time, Amnon son of David fell in love with Tamar, the beautiful sister of Absalom son of David. Amnon became so obsessed with his sister Tamar that he made himself ill. She was a virgin, and it seemed impossible for him to do anything to her. The fact that Amnon was so obsessed with Tamar that it made him physically ill shows how the dysfunction of David's household had created unhealthy dynamics between his children. This wasn't just a random family tragedy, it was the predictable result of a family structure that God had specifically warned against. When we look at David's marriages, we also see a pattern of taking wives for political convenience rather than genuine relationship. His marriage to Abigail, Nabal's widow, secured him an alliance with a wealthy family. His marriage to Maacah connected him to the kingdom of Geshur. His acquisition of Saul's concubines was a political statement about inheriting Saul's kingdom. But here's what's really heartbreaking about this decision. David knew better. In his Psalms, he wrote beautifully about God's faithfulness, about trusting God's provision, about the importance of following God's commands. Yet, when it came to marriage, he chose political expediency over divine instruction. The consequences of David's multiple marriages didn't end with his death. His son Solomon would take this practice to an extreme, eventually having 700 wives and 300 concubines, according to 1 Kings 11:3. The text tells us the result. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. The kingdom that David built through faith in God was ultimately destroyed by the very practice that God had warned against from the beginning. David's decision to ignore God's command about multiple wives created a legacy of family dysfunction, political instability, and spiritual compromise that would plague Israel for generations. What makes this decision particularly tragic is that it was completely unnecessary. David didn't need political marriages to secure his kingdom. God had already promised to establish his throne forever. He didn't need multiple wives to prove his power or status. He was already the most successful king in Israel's history. He chose this path not out of necessity, but out of a desire to manage his kingdom through human wisdom rather than divine instruction. Number 4. Seeking refuge with the Philistines. David's decision to seek refuge with the Philistines wasn't just politically dangerous. It was a complete betrayal of everything he had stood for as Israel's champion and God's anointed king. Let's set the stage. King Saul had been pursuing David relentlessly, trying to kill him out of jealousy and paranoia. David had been living as a fugitive for years, hiding in caves, moving from place to place, constantly looking over his shoulder. It was an exhausting and terrifying existence, and David was beginning to crack under the pressure. The breaking point came when David made a decision based on fear rather than faith. 1 Samuel 27:1 records his thought process. But David thought to himself, "One of these days I will be destroyed by the hand of Saul." The best thing I can do is to escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will give up searching for me anywhere in Israel, and I will slip out of his hand." Notice what's happening here. David wasn't praying about this decision. He wasn't seeking God's guidance. He wasn't remembering all the times God had delivered him from Saul before. He was operating from a place of pure human fear and logic. "One of these days I will be destroyed." David was essentially saying he didn't believe God could continue to protect him. This is the same David who had killed the giant Goliath while declaring in 1 Samuel 17:45, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." The same David who had repeatedly been delivered from Saul's attempts on his life. Yet now, instead of trusting God, he decided to ally himself with Israel's most notorious enemies. So David took his 600 men and their families and fled to Achish, king of Gath, the same Gath where Goliath had come from. Think about the symbolism here. David, who had become famous by killing the Philistine champion, was now seeking protection from the Philistines themselves. The irony would have been lost on no one. The Bible tells us in 1 Samuel 27, 2-3. So David and the 600 men with him left and went over to Achish, son of Maoch, king of Gath. David and his men settled in Gath with Achish. Each man had his family with him, and David had his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, the widow of Nabal. But here's where things get really dark. Living under Philistine protection meant David had to prove his loyalty to them, and the way he chose to do this was absolutely horrific. David began conducting raids against Israel's neighbours, but not just military raids. Complete genocidal attacks designed to leave no survivors who could report back to Achish about what David was really doing. 1 Samuel 27, 8-9 describes David's strategy. Now David and his men went up and raided the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. From ancient times, these peoples had lived in the land extending to Shur and Egypt. Whenever David attacked an area, he did not leave a man or woman alive, but took sheep and cattle, donkeys and camels, and clothes. Then he returned to Achish. Let that sink in for a moment. David was systematically exterminating entire communities, men, women, children, everyone, to maintain his cover story with the Philistines. When Achish asked where he had been raiding, David would lie and say he had been attacking Israelite towns, while actually attacking Israel's enemies. But his method of ensuring no one could contradict his lies was mass murder. The text makes this brutally clear in 1 Samuel 27:11. He did not leave a man or woman alive to be brought to Gath, for he thought, "They might inform on us and say, 'This is what David did.'" And such was his practice as long as he lived in Philistine territory. This wasn't a one-time military action. This was David's regular practice for over a year. He had become a serial killer on a massive scale, all to maintain his deception of the Philistines. The man who would later write, "The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing," was slaughtering innocent people to cover his tracks. The deception worked so well that Achish completely trusted David, saying in 1 Samuel 27:12, "He has become so obnoxious to his people, the Israelites, that he will be my servant for life." Achish believed that David had burned his bridges with Israel so thoroughly that he would have to remain loyal to the Philistines forever. But the real test came when the Philistines decided to go to war against Israel, the same Israel that David was supposed to become king of. In 1 Samuel 28:1-2, Achish said to David, "You must understand that you and your men will accompany me in the army." And David replied, "Then you will see for yourself what your servant can do." David was actually agreeing to fight against his own people, against King Saul, against the very nation God had called him to lead. This is the ultimate consequence of his decision to seek refuge with the Philistines. He was now trapped into potentially killing the people he was meant to save. Fortunately, God intervened through the other Philistine commanders who didn't trust David. 1 Samuel chapter 29 verse 4. But the Philistine commanders were angry with Achish and said, "Send the man back, that he may return to the place you assigned him. He must not go with us into battle, or he will turn against us during the fighting. How better could he regain his master's favour than by taking the heads of our own men?" The Philistine commanders forced Achish to send David away, saving David from the ultimate betrayal of actually fighting against Israel. But even this moment of deliverance was tainted by David's deception. When Achish dismissed him, David had the audacity to act offended, saying in 1 Samuel 29:8, "But what have I done? What have you found against your servant from the day I came to you until now? Why can't I go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king?" David was still lying, still playing his role, even when God was rescuing him from his own terrible decisions. He had become so committed to his deception that he couldn't even be honest when honesty would have served him better. The consequences of this decision were severe and long-lasting. While David was away with the Philistines, the Amalekites raided his base at Ziklag and carried off all the women and children, including David's own wives. 1 Samuel 30:6 tells us that David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. Each one was bitter in spirit because of his sons and daughters. David's own men, who had followed him into exile and supported him through everything, were ready to kill him because his decision to ally with the Philistines had left their families vulnerable to attack. The very people he had been trying to protect were now in danger because of his choices. Even worse, David's time with the Philistines had corrupted his character in ways that would affect him for the rest of his life. The man who had once refused to kill King Saul, even when he had the opportunity, saying, "I will not lay my hand on my Lord because he is the Lord's anointed," had become someone who could systematically murder entire communities to protect his deception. This decision reveals something crucial about how fear can corrupt even the most faithful people. David didn't start out planning to become a mass murderer. He just wanted to escape from Saul's persecution. But one compromise led to another. One lie required bigger lies, and eventually David found himself doing things that would have horrified his younger self. The most tragic aspect of this decision is that it was completely unnecessary. Throughout his time as a fugitive, God had repeatedly delivered David from Saul's attempts to kill him. David had seen miracle after miracle, provision after provision, yet when his faith was truly tested, he chose human wisdom over divine protection. David's refuge with the Philistines stands as one of the clearest examples in his life of what happens when fear overrides faith. When we trust in human alliances more than divine protection, and when we're willing to compromise our values for the sake of temporary safety. Number 3. The adultery with Bathsheba. Now we come to the decision that's probably the most famous of David's failures, and the one that set a catastrophic chain of events in motion that would define the rest of his reign. This isn't just a story about adultery. It's a masterclass in how power corrupts, how small compromises lead to devastating consequences, and how even a man after God's own heart can fall spectacularly when he stops guarding his heart. The setup for this disaster is deceptively simple. 2 Samuel 11:1 tells us, "In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem." Right away, we see the problem. David was supposed to be leading his army, but instead he chose to stay home in comfort while his men went to fight his battles. This decision to abandon his primary responsibility as king created the conditions for everything that followed. The text continues in 2 Samuel 11:2. One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. Now, seeing an attractive woman wasn't David's sin. Attraction happens. The sin came in what David chose to do next. Instead of looking away and going back inside, David chose to investigate further. 2 Samuel 11:3 tells us, "So David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, 'She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite. This is the moment when David's casual glance became an intentional pursuit of a married woman. Here's where we need to understand exactly what David learned about Bathsheba. She wasn't just any married woman. She was the wife of Uriah the Hittite, one of David's elite warriors. According to 2 Samuel 23:39, Uriah is listed among the 30, David's most loyal and skilled fighters. Uriah wasn't just serving in David's army, he was risking his life as part of David's inner circle of warriors. The name daughter of Eliam is also significant. Looking at 2 Samuel 23:34, we see that Eliam was also one of David's mighty men. So Bathsheba was the daughter of one elite warrior and the wife of another. David wasn't just betraying a random soldier, he was betraying the families of his most trusted men. But David had already made his choice. 2 Samuel 11:4 records what happened next. Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. Now she was purifying herself from her monthly uncleanness. Then she went back home. That parenthetical note about her purification is crucial. It establishes the timing and makes clear that there could be no question about who fathered any child that resulted from this encounter. The text is also clear about the power dynamic here. David sent messengers to get her. This wasn't a romantic seduction. This was the king using his absolute power to summon a subject for his pleasure. Now, there's been significant debate about Bathsheba's agency in this situation. Some have tried to paint her as a seductress, but the text doesn't support that interpretation. She was bathing in what she likely thought was the privacy of her own home. When the king's messengers arrived at her door, she had no real choice but to comply. In ancient Israel, refusing a king's summons could mean death. From Bathsheba's perspective, this was likely a terrifying situation. She was a married woman whose husband was away fighting the king's wars. When that same king summoned her to the palace, she would have understood exactly what was expected of her, and she would have known that resistance was futile. From David's perspective, though, this was a moment where he chose his own desires over everything he claimed to believe in. The man who had written in Psalm 101 verse 3, "I will not look with approval on anything that is vile. I hate what faithless people do. I will have no part in it," was now actively pursuing a married woman. David knew the law. Leviticus 20:10 was crystal clear. If a man commits adultery with another man's wife, with the wife of his neighbour, both the adulterer and the adulteress are to be put to death. David wasn't just risking his own life, he was putting Bathsheba's life in danger too. But perhaps most tragically, David knew exactly who Uriah was. This wasn't an anonymous soldier fighting in some distant campaign. Uriah was one of David's personal warriors, a man who had risked his life countless times for his king. While Uriah was out fighting David's battles, David was betraying him in the worst possible way. What makes this decision particularly devastating is that David had everything he could possibly want. 2 Samuel 5:13 tells us that David took more concubines and wives in Jerusalem, and 1 Chronicles 3:1-9 list multiple sons born to him by different wives and concubines. David had legitimate access to multiple women, unlimited wealth, absolute power, and the favour of God. But he saw something that belonged to someone else, and he decided that being king meant he could take it. The adultery itself was bad enough, but what happened next reveals just how corrupted David's thinking had become. 2 Samuel 11:5 tells us, "The woman conceived and sent word to David saying, 'I am pregnant.' Instead of immediately confessing his sin and accepting the consequences, David's first instinct was to cover it up. This is where we see how one bad decision inevitably leads to worse ones. David could have confessed to Nathan the prophet, accepted God's discipline, and dealt with the situation honourably. Instead, he chose deception, which would lead to attempted manipulation of Uriah, which would lead to murder. But the most tragic aspect of this decision is what it reveals about how power had corrupted David's character. the young shepherd who had refused to kill King Saul even when he had the opportunity, saying in 1 Samuel 26:20, "But now do not let my blood fall to the ground far from the presence of the Lord." The king of Israel has come out to look for a flea, as one hunts a partridge in the mountains, had become someone who would abuse his power to take whatever he wanted. David's adultery with Bathsheba wasn't just a moment of weakness. It was the culmination of a gradual moral deterioration that had been happening as he grew more comfortable with power. The man who had once been content to trust God's timing had become someone who took what he wanted when he wanted it, regardless of the cost to others. The consequences began immediately. God saw everything, and through the prophet Nathan, he would confront David with the full horror of what he had done. In 2 Samuel 12:9, Nathan would declare God's judgment. "Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own." This decision reveals something crucial about power and temptation. David had been faithful through years of persecution, through battles and political struggles, but when he had power and comfort, that's when he fell. Sometimes our greatest failures happen not when we're struggling, but when we think we're safe and can let our guard down. The adultery with Bathsheba became the turning point in David's reign. Everything that came after, the murder of Uriah, the family dysfunction, Absalom's rebellion, the civil war, all of it can be traced back to this moment when David chose his desires over his duties, his pleasure over his principles, and his power over his integrity. Number 2, the Amnon situation. If you think David's personal failures were catastrophic, wait until you see what happened when he completely abdicated his responsibility as both a father and a king in handling the most heinous crime committed within his own household. This is the decision that truly demonstrates how David's moral compromises had corrupted his ability to lead his own family, and how his pattern of avoiding difficult decisions created the conditions for unimaginable tragedy. Let me paint the full picture of this horror for you, because the biblical account doesn't hold back any of the disturbing details. David's eldest son Amnon had developed what the text calls love for his half-sister Tamar. But this wasn't love, it was predatory obsession. 2 Samuel 13:1-2 describes the situation. In the course of time, Amnon, son of David, fell in love with Tamar, the beautiful sister of Absalom, son of David. Amnon became so obsessed with his sister Tamar that he made himself ill. She was a virgin, and it seemed impossible for him to do anything to her. Notice the language here. Amnon was so consumed with his inappropriate desire that it was affecting his physical health. This wasn't a sudden temptation. This was a festering obsession that had been building over time. And rather than dealing with these feelings appropriately or seeking help, Amnon chose to act on them in the most depraved way possible. Enter Jonadab, Amnon's cousin, who is described in 2 Samuel 13:3 as a very shrewd man. The Hebrew word used here suggests cunning and craftiness, not wisdom. When Jonadab saw how miserable Amnon looked, he didn't counsel him toward righteousness. Instead, he devised a plan that would enable Amnon's evil desires. 2 Samuel chapter 13 verses 4-5 records their conversation. He asked Amnon, "Why do you, the king's son, look so haggard morning after morning? Won't you tell me?" Amnon said to him, "I'm in love with Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister." "Go to bed and pretend to be ill," Jonadab said. "When your father comes to see you, say to him, 'I would like my sister Tamar to come and give me something to eat. Let her prepare the food in my sight so I may watch her, and then eat from her hand.'" This plan was diabolical in its simplicity and its exploitation of family relationships. Amnon would fake an illness, knowing that his father the king would come to check on him. Then he would specifically request Tamar to care for him, knowing that David would see this as a reasonable request from one sibling to another. The plan depended entirely on exploiting David's paternal concern and Tamar's sisterly compassion. The plan worked perfectly. 2 Samuel 13:6-7 tells us, "So Amnon lay down and pretended to be ill. When the king came to see him, Amnon said to him, "I would like my sister Tamar to come and make some special bread in my sight, so I may eat from her hand." David sent word to Tamar at the palace, "Go to the house of your brother Amnon and prepare some food for him." David, completely unsuspecting, sent his daughter directly into danger. This reveals something crucial about the dysfunction in David's household. He was so disconnected from his children that he had no sense of the inappropriate dynamics developing between them. When Tamar arrived at Amnon's house, she did exactly what she had been asked to do. 2 Samuel 13:8-9 describes her innocent compliance. So Tamar went to the house of her brother Amnon, who was lying down. She took some dough, kneaded it, made the bread in his sight and baked it. Then she took the pan and served him the bread, but he refused to eat. "Send everyone out of here," Amnon said. So everyone left him. At this point, Tamar probably realized something was wrong, but she was trapped. Amnon had cleared the house of all potential witnesses or protectors. What happened next is recorded with brutal honesty in 2 Samuel 13:11-14. But when she took it to him to eat, he grabbed her and said, "Come to bed with me, my sister." "No, my brother," she said to him. "Don't force me. Such a thing should not be done in Israel. Don't do this wicked thing. What about me? Where could I get rid of my disgrace? And what about you? You would be like one of the wicked fools in Israel. Please speak to the king. He will not keep me from being given to you." But he refused to listen to her, and since he was stronger than she, he raped her. Tamar's response reveals several important things. First, she understood that what Amnon was proposing was not just morally wrong, but legally forbidden in Israel. Second, she tried to reason with him, pointing out that this would destroy both their reputations and futures. Third, and most tragically, she even suggested that he ask David for permission to marry her, thinking that might be a way to avoid the assault. But Amnon was beyond reason. The aftermath of the assault reveals the true nature of Amnon's love. 2 Samuel 13:15 tells us, "Then Amnon hated her with intense hatred. In fact, he hated her more than he had loved her. Amnon said to her, 'Get up and get out.' This wasn't love at all. It was selfish lust that, once satisfied, turned immediately to disgust and rejection. Tamar's response to this additional humiliation shows her understanding of the law and custom. 2 Samuel 13:16 records her words. "No," she said to him, "sending me away would be a greater wrong than what you have already done to me." Under Israelite law, a man who assaulted a virgin was required to marry her and provide for her. By throwing her out, Amnon was compounding his crime and leaving her with no legal protection or recourse. But Amnon's selfishness was complete. 2 Samuel 13:17-18 shows his callous disregard for both law and human decency. But he refused to listen to her. He called his personal servant and said, "Get this woman out of my sight and bolt the door after her." So his servant put her out and bolted the door after her. She was wearing an ornate robe, for this was the kind of garment the virgin daughters of the king wore. The mention of Tamar's ornate robe is significant. It was a symbol of her status as an unmarried princess. By the end of this encounter, that robe would be torn, symbolizing the destruction of her status, her future, and her hope for a normal life. 2 Samuel 13:19 describes Tamar's immediate response to the assault. Tamar put ashes on her head and tore the ornate robe she was wearing. She put her hand on her head and went away, weeping aloud as she went. These were traditional signs of mourning and shame. Tamar was publicly declaring that something terrible had happened to her, hoping that someone in authority would take notice and provide justice. Her brother Absalom found her in this state, and his response revealed both his love for his sister and his understanding that justice was unlikely to come from their father. 2 Samuel 13:20 records his words. Absalom, her brother, said to her, "Has that Amnon, your brother, been with you? Be quiet for now, my sister. He is your brother. Don't take this thing to heart." And Tamar lived in her brother Absalom's house, a desolate woman. Absalom's advice to be quiet for now and "Don't take this thing to heart," wasn't callous indifference. It was a recognition that bringing this matter to public attention would likely result in more harm to Tamar without bringing justice against Amnon. The phrase, "a desolate woman," indicates that Tamar's life was essentially over. Her future, her hope for marriage and children, her place in society, all of it had been destroyed by Amnon's crime. Now comes the moment that defines David's character more clearly than perhaps any other decision in his life. 2 Samuel 13 verse 21 tells us, "When King David heard all this, he was furious." David's emotional response was appropriate. He was angry about what had happened to his daughter. But then comes the devastating next sentence, "nothing." The text records David's fury, but no action whatsoever. This wasn't a case where David was unaware of what had happened. The text explicitly states that he heard all this. He knew that his son had raped his daughter. He knew that Tamar was living as a desolate woman in Absalom's house. He knew that a serious crime had been committed that demanded royal justice, and he chose to do absolutely nothing about it. David's inaction sent a clear message to everyone involved. To Tamar, it communicated that her suffering didn't matter enough to warrant justice. To Amnon, it communicated that royal sons were above the law. To Absalom, it communicated that if he wanted justice for his sister, he would have to obtain it himself. To the entire kingdom, it communicated that the king's own family was exempt from the standards he expected everyone else to follow. The law was clear about what should have happened. Deuteronomy 22:25-27 stated, "But if out in the country a man happens to meet a young woman pledged to be married and rapes her, only the man who has done this shall die. Do nothing to the young woman. She has committed no sin deserving death." This case is like that of someone who attacks and murders a neighbour, for the man found the young woman out in the country, and though the betrothed woman screamed, there was no one to rescue her. While Tamar wasn't betrothed, the principle was clear. Rape was a capital crime in Israel. At minimum, Amnon should have faced severe legal consequences. But David's failure to act meant that the rapist faced no consequences at all, while the victim was left to suffer in isolation. Absalom's response to David's inaction reveals the depth of his anger and disappointment in his father. 2 Samuel 13:22 tells us, "And Absalom never said a word to Amnon, either good or bad. He hated Amnon because he had disgraced his sister Tamar." Absalom's silence wasn't forgiveness. It was the quiet anger of someone planning revenge. For 2 full years, Absalom waited for David to act. For 2 years, he watched his sister live in desolation while her rapist continued to enjoy all the privileges of being a prince. For 2 years, he gave his father opportunity after opportunity to provide the justice that only a king could provide. But David's continued inaction finally convinced Absalom that if Tamar was going to receive any justice at all, he would have to provide it himself. The climax came during a sheep shearing festival that Absalom organised. 2 Samuel 13:23-27 describes how Absalom invited all the king's sons, including Amnon, to a celebration. When David initially declined to attend, Absalom specifically requested that Amnon be allowed to come. David granted this request, sending all his sons to what he thought was a family celebration. 2 Samuel 13:28-29 records what actually happened. Absalom ordered his men, "Listen, when Amnon is in high spirits from drinking wine and I say to you, 'Strike Amnon down, then kill him,' don't be afraid. Haven't I given you this order? Be strong and brave." So Absalom's men did to Amnon what Absalom had ordered. Absalom had waited for the perfect moment, when Amnon was drunk and vulnerable, when there would be no question about who was responsible for his death, when the execution would have the maximum symbolic impact. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was carefully planned justice carried out when the proper authorities had failed to act. The immediate aftermath was chaos. 2 Samuel chapter 13 verses 30-31 describes David's response. While they were on their way, the report came to David. Absalom has struck down all the king's sons, not one of them is left. The king stood up, tore his clothes and lay down on the ground, and all his attendants stood by with their clothes torn. Initially, David received an exaggerated report that all his sons had been killed. But even when the truth was clarified, that only Amnon had died, David's response was telling. He mourned intensely for the son who had committed rape but had shown no similar concern for the daughter who had been victimized. His priorities were completely backwards. David's handling of the Amnon situation represents perhaps the most complete failure of leadership in his entire reign. He failed as a father to protect his daughter and discipline his son. He failed as a king to enforce justice according to God's law. He failed as a moral leader to demonstrate that righteousness matters more than family loyalty. His decision to do nothing when decisive action was required created the conditions for even greater tragedy and set in motion the conflicts that would eventually tear his kingdom apart. Number 1, staying home when kings go to war. And now we come to the decision that started it all, a seemingly minor choice that would cascade into every other disaster that followed. It's buried in a single verse that most people read right past, but this represents one of the most consequential abdications of responsibility in biblical history: David's decision to abandon his fundamental duty as a warrior king. 2 Samuel 11:1 records this pivotal moment. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. That simple phrase, David remained in Jerusalem, represents a complete betrayal of everything David had built his kingship upon. To understand just how radical this decision was, we need to grasp what kingship meant in the ancient world. Kings weren't just political figures who made policy from a throne room. They were military commanders whose primary job was leading their armies in battle. The king's presence on the battlefield wasn't ceremonial. It was absolutely essential for morale, strategy, and the spiritual dimension of warfare that was central to Israelite military thinking. This was especially true for David, whose entire rise to power had been built on military leadership. This was the man who, as a young shepherd, had declared to the Philistine giant in 1 Samuel 17:45-47, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." David's reputation was forged in combat. 1 Samuel 18:5 tells us that, whatever mission Saul sent him on, David was so successful that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. This pleased all the troops, and Saul's officers as well. His men followed him not because of his royal bloodline or political connections, but because he had proven himself as a warrior who shared their dangers. Even during his darkest period as a fugitive from King Saul, David continued to function as a military leader. 1 Samuel 22:2 records how all those who were in distress or in debt or discontented gathered around him, and he became their commander. About 400 men were with him. These weren't just followers seeking protection. They were fighters who trusted David to lead them effectively in battle. The quality of warriors who came to David during his exile tells us everything about his military reputation. 1 Chronicles 12:8 describes some of them. Some Gadites defected to David at his stronghold in the wilderness. They were brave warriors, ready for battle and able to handle the shield and spear. Their faces were the faces of lions, and they were as swift as gazelles in the mountains. Elite soldiers don't follow someone unless they have absolute confidence in their military leadership. When David finally became king, his personal military leadership remained the cornerstone of his success. 2 Samuel 5:17-25 describes multiple occasions when David personally led battles against the Philistines, carefully seeking God's guidance for military strategy and personally commanding the troops in combat. The text emphasizes that David inquired of the Lord before each engagement and then executed the battle plans himself. David's military leadership wasn't just about personal bravery, it was about the spiritual dimension of Israel's warfare. In ancient Israel, military campaigns were understood as holy wars where God's presence with the king was essential for victory. When David stayed home, he wasn't just abandoning military duty, he was breaking the spiritual connection between divine guidance and military action that had made Israel's army so effective. The specific context of this decision makes it even more problematic. The campaign against the Ammonites wasn't some minor border skirmish that could be handled by subordinates. This war had begun when the Ammonites grievously insulted David's ambassadors, as recorded in 2 Samuel chapter 10 verse 4. So Hanun seized David's envoys, shaved off half of each man's beard, cut off their garments at the buttocks, and sent them away. This was a direct personal insult to David and a public challenge to Israel's honour that demanded the king's personal response. The Ammonites had then escalated the conflict by hiring Syrian mercenaries, creating a two-front war that required sophisticated military coordination. Initially, David had responded appropriately. When the Syrians brought in additional forces from across the Euphrates River, 2 Samuel 10:17 tells us that when David was told of this, he gathered all Israel, crossed the Jordan and went to Helam. David personally led this critical battle, and the result was a decisive victory that broke the Syrian-Ammonite alliance. But then, when it came time for the follow-up siege of Rabbah, the campaign that would finish off the Ammonites and complete the victory, David chose comfort over duty. He had proven he could still lead when the situation was desperate, but when it came to the less glamorous work of siege warfare, he decided his presence wasn't necessary. This decision reveals a fundamental shift in David's character. The man who had once declared that the battle is the Lord's was now treating warfare as something that could be delegated while he remained in comfort. He had begun to view his military leadership as optional rather than essential, not understanding that leadership isn't something you can turn on and off based on personal preference. The impact on his soldiers must have been devastating. These were men who had followed David through years of hardship and danger, who had trusted him with their lives countless times. Now they were facing the dangers of siege warfare, one of the most brutal and costly forms of ancient combat, while their king remained safe in his palace. The message this sent about David's priorities and commitment was unmistakable. From a strategic standpoint, David's absence also weakened the military effectiveness of the campaign. Siege warfare required constant decision-making about tactics, resource allocation, and response to enemy countermeasures. While Joab was an excellent field commander, he lacked the authority to make major strategic decisions without consulting David. This created delays and inefficiencies that prolonged the siege and increased casualties among David's men. But perhaps most significantly, David's decision represented a fundamental break with his own understanding of how God worked through Israel's military operations. Throughout his career, David had sought divine guidance before every major military decision. His psalms are filled with references to God as his strength in battle, his shield against enemies, and his guide in military strategy. By staying home, David was essentially saying that seeking God's will for this campaign wasn't worth his personal involvement. The timing of this decision is particularly revealing. This wasn't early in David's reign, when he might have been focused on establishing domestic policies, and it wasn't late in his reign when age might have made military campaigning difficult. This was during David's prime, when he was still fully capable of military leadership but had simply grown comfortable with the idea that others could handle the difficult parts of kingship while he enjoyed the pleasant aspects. What makes this decision so tragic is that it was completely unnecessary. There was no compelling reason for David to stay in Jerusalem during this campaign. The kingdom was secure. There were no major domestic crises requiring his attention, and his health was good. He stayed home simply because he preferred comfort to duty, delegation to direct leadership, and personal ease to the demanding work of military command. This represents a fundamental corruption of David's understanding of kingship. Early in his reign, David had understood that being king meant serving his people by sharing their burdens and dangers. But success and security had gradually corrupted this understanding, leading him to believe that being king meant others should serve him while he remained comfortable and safe. The decision to stay home when kings go to war wasn't just a military failure. It was a spiritual failure that revealed how far David had drifted from his original calling as a man after God's own heart. It showed that he had begun to trust in his own established power, rather than continuing to seek God's guidance and strength for each new challenge. This decision set the pattern for all the moral failures that would follow, demonstrating how abandoning our primary responsibilities creates the conditions where other failures become almost inevitable. David's choice of comfort over duty didn't just affect one military campaign. It fundamentally altered his character and opened the door to the disasters that would define the rest of his reign.